A 26-year-old inherited 4 dead fish ponds and $4,000 worth of worthless land. Everyone told her to sell. She didn't listen, and here's what happened next. The trucks showed up on a Tuesday, just like every other week. 3 plain, unmarked trucks rolled down a dirt road toward the old Halverson Ponds, a spot outside a town so tiny it didn't even have a traffic light. The drivers barely said a word. They just opened the tanks and let thousands of baby fish spill into water that hadn't held a healthy fish in 6 years. Neighbors slowed down on the road to watch. Some shook their heads. A few laughed, because everyone around there knew exactly what those ponds were. Mud pits, a tax write-off, the place where a man named Halverson had once tried and failed to run a catfish farm 20 years earlier. Nothing had survived there since. So when the water suddenly came alive with movement, thousands of silver fish flashing in the morning light, people had one obvious question: why would anyone throw good fish into a graveyard? And once they found out who had asked for them, the question got even stranger. Because the woman standing at the edge of that pond, clipboard in hand, boots sinking into mud that hadn't been touched in years, wasn't a farmer. She wasn't a fish expert. Her family had never raised so much as a goldfish. She was just 26 years old, and she had asked the hatchery for more fish than they were planning to dump. Not less. More. Even the hatchery's own drivers thought she was making a huge mistake. One of them, an older guy who'd hauled fish for 30 years, pulled her aside before leaving and told her something she'd never forget, though not for the reason he meant. He told her these fish were junk. Off-grade. The kind nobody wanted and nobody would pay for. She thanked him for the warning. Then she asked when the next truck was coming. If you believe that opportunity often hides in the places other people call worthless, stick around. This story is worth it. And if you're watching from a farm, a small town, or anywhere far from the coast, let us know in the comments. We always want to hear where you're from. Her name was Delaney Cross. A year before this story starts, she didn't know a baby fish from a minnow. She grew up 2 counties over, mostly raised by her grandfather after her parents split when she was 9. He wasn't a fish man either. He'd spent 40 years running a small orchard that barely broke even but never quite failed. He was the type who fixed things instead of throwing them out, who believed almost anything that got thrown away still had some use left in it, if you were patient enough to find it. He passed away the winter before this all began. While going through his things afterward, Delaney found a piece of land she never knew he owned. 6 acres with 4 old fish farming ponds, only 3 of which still held water. He'd bought it decades earlier from a bankrupt catfish business for almost nothing, then just paid the taxes and let it sit, never doing anything with it. Attached to the deed, in his own handwriting, was a short note. Not sentimental. Not explained. Just one line: some things aren't broken. They're just waiting on the right person to notice them. She didn't get it at first. Not then. But she'd keep thinking about it all year, turning it over in her mind like a stone, looking for what was hidden underneath. And it wouldn't fully click until the very end of this story, when she'd finally realize her grandfather wasn't talking about the land at all. At the time, she was working a job she didn't love, renting an apartment she could barely afford, and holding a deed to 4 empty ponds that felt like exactly the kind of nothing her family always seemed to inherit. She almost sold the land. A local buyer offered her $4,000 for it, barely worth the drive out to look at it. But something about her grandfather's note stopped her from signing. So instead of selling, she drove out to see what she actually owned. The ponds were worse than she expected. Cracked banks, a rusted solid aerator system, water that smelled off even from inside her truck. But nearby was a fisheries extension office, 40 minutes away, run by a man named Roy Tanner who'd spent 30 years advising failed fish farms just like this one. She walked in with phone photos and a question she felt embarrassed to even ask out loud. Could this land ever be worth anything again? Roy didn't laugh at her, she appreciated that, but he didn't sugarcoat it either. He told her fixing up even the 3 ponds that still had water would cost more than she had. He said most people who tried this failed within a year, and that if she wanted a real return on that land, growing hay would be far easier than raising fish. He barely mentioned the 4th, dry pond. Just noted its bottom soil looked better than the others and that it might be worth something someday, if she ever got that far. She didn't think much of that comment at the time. Before leaving, she asked one more question. If she somehow got the ponds working, where could she even get fish cheap enough to start? That question is what led her, 3 weeks later, to a hatchery 90 miles north, and to roughly 6,000 baby fish that nobody else wanted. The reason was almost boringly simple. The hatchery had overproduced a batch of catfish and hybrid bream for a restaurant supply deal that fell through at the last second. On top of that, a mix-up had mixed bream in with catfish stock in one tank, meaning none of it met the standards commercial buyers required. The hatchery was now stuck with tens of thousands of fish it couldn't legally sell as pure stock and couldn't afford to keep feeding. Normally that meant paying a disposal fee just to destroy the surplus. Biosecurity rules didn't allow dumping them into any random waterway, and holding costs were eating into profits fast. So when Delaney called asking to take some off their hands for free, the hatchery manager, a blunt woman named Carol Reyes, was almost suspicious, as if Delaney was trying to pull some kind of scam. Nobody ever asked for reject stock. And certainly nobody asked for more of it than was being offered. But Carol had been in the business long enough to know mixed-species ponds weren't automatically worthless. They just couldn't be sold as one clean, graded product. If Delaney was willing to sort, raise, and manage two species together herself, that was Delaney's problem, not the hatchery's. Carol agreed, mostly because it solved her own disposal headache, and because she figured the ponds would collapse before the fish ever grew big enough to matter. That deal is what brought 3 unmarked trucks down a gravel road, and a crowd of doubtful neighbors who slowed down just to watch a woman they were sure would regret this. The first few weeks nearly proved them right. She'd patched up the worst of the bank erosion and gotten one rusty aerator limping back to life. But she hadn't realized how fast oxygen can vanish from water on a still, humid night. 3 days after the first delivery, she woke up to find nearly 2,000 baby fish floating dead in the shallow end of Pond 2. She hadn't yet understood that overnight oxygen loss is the single biggest killer in small fish farms, that fish use up oxygen all night with no sunlight to replace it, and a pond without enough surface movement basically suffocates its own stock in the dark. When she called Roy Tanner in a panic, he didn't say, "I told you so." He walked her through setting up a simple paddle aerator, run off a cheap generator timer, to keep the water moving through the most dangerous hours before dawn. It used up almost all the cash she had left, but it saved the rest of the batch. Then came the rain. One storm dumped 4 inches in a single night and blew out a section of bank she'd only patched instead of properly rebuilding, draining a quarter of Pond 1 before she managed to plug the break with sandbags and clay at 2 a.m., soaked to the bone, cursing every choice that had brought her there. Then came the herons. Nobody warns you about herons. A pair of them found the shallow water irresistible and picked off hundreds of her smaller fish before she strung up cheap bird netting along the edges. An ugly, unglamorous fix that worked far better than anything expensive would have. Just when she thought the worst was behind her, a totally different problem showed up, one that had nothing to do with water or weather. Feed prices spiked that fall because of a soybean meal shortage that had nothing to do with her operation and everything to do with markets she'd never even thought to watch. Overnight, her single biggest recurring cost jumped by nearly a third. She'd budgeted carefully for everything else, just not that. For a few weeks she considered underfeeding the fish to stretch her supply, a shortcut Roy warned her against the second she brought it up. He told her fish that don't get enough protein at the right growth stage don't just grow slower. They grow uneven, weak, and more prone to disease, and any money saved on feed gets wiped out twice over in losses later. So instead, she renegotiated with a smaller regional feed supplier who'd sell in bulk at a discount if she committed to a full season contract. Less flexibility, but steadier costs she could actually plan around. Every disaster taught her something the last one hadn't. She learned to read the water, not by looking at the surface, but by watching how the fish moved beneath it. Sluggish movement near dawn meant oxygen trouble. Fish gathering near inflow pipes meant they were stressed and hunting for fresher water. She learned that feed wasn't something you just poured in. Protein levels had to shift as the fish grew, richer early on, leaner later, or she'd either waste money overfeeding or stunt their growth. She learned to check water temperature at different depths, because warm surface water could hide a cold, oxygen-starved bottom layer where her fish might be quietly struggling. By late summer, Delaney had lost just over a third of her original 6,000 fish to early mistakes. But she still had thousands alive and growing, catfish and hybrid bream, in water that was finally starting to behave the way it should. Her first sale happened almost by accident. A neighbor who'd mocked the whole thing from his porch showed up one evening, half joking, asking if she had anything worth eating yet. She sold him 4 catfish out of a cooler, cleaned them herself at his kitchen sink because he had no idea how. By the next week, he'd told 2 friends. Word spread slowly at first, a table at the farmer's market, a phone call from a diner 2 towns over, but it kept moving. The real turning point came when a restaurant owner named Marcus Webb drove out after hearing about her from a distributor who'd tried her fish and been genuinely impressed. Marcus ran a small, well-regarded seafood restaurant 40 minutes away, the kind of place that actually cared where its food came from. He didn't want a charity case. He wanted consistency. The same size, same quality, every single delivery. That one requirement forced Delaney into the hardest lesson of her whole first year: grading. Because she'd started with mixed, off-grade stock, her fish grew unevenly. Some catfish hit market weight fast, others lagged behind. Restaurants wouldn't accept a delivery box with 3 different sizes mixed together. She had to learn to sort fish by size at every growth stage, moving the slower growers into their own section of the pond to catch up. Grading turned out to be more than just sorting. It was a whole management approach, with every pond tuned slightly differently for a different stage of a fish's life. She got Marcus's order wrong twice before finally getting it right. He nearly walked away after the second failure, but she showed up in person, admitted the mistake with no excuses, and asked for one more shot with a smaller order she could actually guarantee. He gave her that chance. It turned into a standing weekly account. From there, growth happened the way real growth actually happens. Slower than any highlight reel, but faster than doing nothing at all. Local sales grew into regular farmers' market customers. Those regulars turned into 2 more restaurant accounts. Each new account came with its own small, unglamorous lesson. One buyer wanted delivery before sunrise, meaning she had to learn to harvest and pack fish on ice the night before without letting the quality slip. Another wanted formal invoicing and volume commitments, things she'd never had to think about back when she was just selling out of a cooler at a market stall. Transportation became its own quiet battle. Her first delivery truck was really just an old flatbed with a single insulated cooler in the back, fine for short local trips, but useless once a buyer was more than half an hour out. She lost an entire delivery to heat before she learned exactly how quickly fresh-packed fish could spoil without the right ice-to-fish ratio and proper airflow inside the cooler. Getting that right was the difference between a restaurant that trusted her and one that quietly stopped calling. A regional distributor, hearing about her consistent hybrid bream, offered her a contract with volume requirements that honestly scared her. More fish than her 3 ponds could reliably produce. That contract forced her hardest decision yet: stay small or expand. She took out a loan she genuinely hated taking, fixed up the 4th pond that Roy had said from the start had potential, and hired her first employee, a laid-off hatchery worker named Denny, who understood grading and disease prevention better than she did, and taught her almost as much as Roy had. Disease hit that winter, a bacterial outbreak that swept through one pond and threatened to spread to the others. She and Denny caught it early, thanks to a habit she'd built without even realizing it, walking the banks every single morning, watching for fish acting strangely. She'd learned that the earliest warning signs were almost never dramatic, just fish behaving slightly off. She got through that outbreak with losses instead of total collapse, because by then she could spot trouble before it turned into disaster. By her second year, Delaney had added basic processing, a small cold storage unit, and a simple smoking setup that let her sell not just fresh fish, but smoked catfish to specialty grocery stores, doubling her margin on stock that would otherwise have sold for commodity prices. She learned all the unglamorous mechanics of a real seafood business: cold chain logistics, the harsh math of ice and travel time, how a single missed delivery could cost her a restaurant account she'd spent a year building. She crossed 6 figures in revenue near the end of that second year, not through one dramatic sale, but through the slow, steady buildup of accounts, contracts, and a reputation nobody could have predicted the day 3 trucks first backed down that gravel road. Carol Reyes, the hatchery manager who'd once been suspicious of her request, became one of her most reliable suppliers, sending Delaney the same kind of off-grade, mixed-species stock other buyers rejected, because Delaney was the only person in 3 counties who knew what to do with it. Late one evening, walking the bank of the very pond where she'd lost those first 2,000 fish, Delaney finally understood her grandfather's note. He hadn't meant the land at all. He'd meant her. All those years she'd doubted whether she had the patience or the instinct for anything difficult. All those times she'd assumed she was just ordinary, in a family that specialized in quietly fixing what looked broken. He'd seen something in her long before she ever saw it in herself. The ponds were never really the inheritance. The real inheritance was the willingness to notice value where everyone else only saw waste. The trucks still show up sometimes, dropping off stock other buyers won't touch. Delaney still walks the banks every morning before sunrise, watching the water the way her grandfather once watched his orchard, not for what it obviously was, but for what it could still become. Nobody in that county laughs any more when a truck backs down toward her ponds. They still watch, same as always, except now they're watching to see what she'll build next. What this story really leaves you with isn't a formula for getting rich off discarded fish. It's simpler than that, and harder. Most opportunity doesn't show up looking like opportunity. It shows up looking like a mistake, a mess, something somebody else already gave up on. The people who succeed aren't the ones with the most resources or the most obvious talent. They're the ones patient enough to sit with something broken long enough to understand what it could still become, and stubborn enough to keep learning from failure until they finally get it right. Somewhere near you, right now, there's probably something just like those ponds, written off, overlooked, just waiting for someone willing to notice it.